No, Martti is there.
But try sometimes. Okay, hello, hello. Yeah.
There you go. You can just say hello.
Okay. Okay, this is Liliana and Martti, June 12, 2013, Lake Saima. Okay, so we're here to interview. I'm here to interview Martti on Eurocentrism for an article that will appear in a book dedicated to your work and to critiques of your work. So the idea that I had for that article is the critique of Eurocentrism from Martti's Eurocentrism. And well, I have several questions related to that, but I guess the first one would be to ask you in your work, when did you first encounter Eurocentrism as a problem in the type of work that you've done in international?
Well, I suppose first time when I started reading critical literatures in the 80s, and I guess when I started to think about what kind of a profile as a scholar I should have and what kinds of literatures are interesting to me, then one could not avoid the topos of Eurocentrism. In the 80s it was still unclear to me what that topos would involve. I think also the debate itself has developed quite a bit from the 80s. And one always had a left, not always, I used to be a conservative, but for a long time one has been a left person. So the problem of Europe's omnipresence and Europe's historical legacy, as well as the extremely boring character of everything about Europe, so came together with this sense of trying to find one's scientific, legal orientation.
So how would you define Eurocentrism? Because you have a recent article on Eurocentrism, but how did you come to that, to actually write specifically on Eurocentrism after being conscious?
There are several meanings of Eurocentrism. I think first one came to it as a problem among other problems, like social injustice and the position of women and Eurocentrism. But at some point, Eurocentrism, the nature of Eurocentrism changed. So it didn't seem to be quite like those other problems that you can deal with, with social instruments and technologies and thought. Eurocentrism was like this alien from the movie Alien. So it was inside. So it had at some point, whoops. So I realized that one was oneself completely Eurocentric. Exactly. That one's vocabulary, one's experience, one's education, one's view of the world was Eurocentric. Now, I was never obsessed about my own view of the world or my own vocabularies, and it was easy always for me to have an ironic distance towards myself. I'm not so enchanted about myself. So I thought, well, okay, so this can be a kind of self-analysis as well. And that everything that one says about those other problems, social injustice, especially gender problems, problems in education, and so on, that even those problems were articulated through a Eurocentric vocabulary. So that the critiques themselves were kind of Eurocentric. So then it started to appear like a really formidable issue, something that could not be dealt with in the same level as others, because it was always involved in the very process of dealing with it.
So that would lead to the question, is if you could actually be apart from your own Eurocentrism, and I don't mean Martti Koskenniemi, I mean anyone who does international law or international legal history, has to have a Eurocentric position because of the the roots of international law, I could say. So I remember very much when the first time we met, which was in 1999, and I presented this paper on the Latin Americans, and you were writing your Gentle Civilizer. And at the end of the talk, you came up to me and said, "Oh, that's great. You need to keep on writing about this because I'm writing the other story, but this is the part that's not well known," etc. And later, I came to realize that my Latin Americans were as Eurocentric. I mean, they were trying to position themselves, but through a very Eurocentric also. Discourse and tools. They didn't want to be marginal. They wanted to be at the center, right? And to do that, they have to use language. I mean, from writing in French to being in Paris or in Geneva.
Yes.
And so their position wasn't to be left out. It was actually to be centers of production of knowledge as well, right? So in that sense, they were as Eurocentric as
yes.
So it's very interesting to see later the Twale people using the Latin Americans as initiators, but then when they understood that these guys were as colonialist or as Eurocentric as the Europeans, then they had this strange feeling, no, about the Latin Americans. So going back to that position, is it possible to not be Eurocentric in a way?
Well, I suppose so. That depends on where one is and what it is that one does.
Without being marginalized completely from the fields.
Yeah, so that's, I suppose, in post-colonial studies, that's a very classical big problem with which you deal. Is it possible to say anything without having to adopt a vocabulary that commits you to speaking a Eurocentric language? And yeah, I suppose there is a way in which one can say that when one is working in an intellectual field or a technological or economic field, working in the academia, the very idea of the academy is a European idea. So in that sense, one is committed to Eurocentrism, and that's just an aspect of the fact that Europe has ruled the world for a long time. We cannot wish it away and then it would disappear and we would have some other thing which would no longer be Eurocentric. That's a fact. But I don't think that this commits anybody to paralysis or to silence. And there are different ways in which one can deal with this, and in many fields, anthropology and social sciences, general, maybe even in law, people have tried to develop techniques that would create a certain distance or insert attention in the Eurocentric vocabulary, so that this would destabilize the vocabulary itself. So the trope about hybrids would be one trope, and we can think of hybridity in different ways. I think hybridity, on the other hand, is just a special case of something that I would like to call schizophrenic attitude or ironic attitude to one's vocabularies and oneself, so that one is always speaking there but not quite there. That one is at the same time the fly on the wall who observes one in operation in a Eurocentric language, always ready to take a critical position towards any substantive resolution that one suggests can be attained through that Eurocentric language. I admit that when one thinks in those terms, one is still kind of captured in the iron cage of Eurocentrism, or the alien is still there, but at least one is conscious of it and one tries to do what one can do. There is also, I think, and I find myself saying this to students in class, that there is a sense in which at some points Europeans just need to stop talking, and that there is, so you can go only so far, but then you don't have a legitimacy of speaking any longer. And I feel that that's extremely hard for many of us Europeans. Just stop talking. So I've even had to admit to myself that the same exact proposition is legitimate when it comes from somebody who is not a European than when it comes to somebody who's in the other camp.
Okay.
So the verity of propositions might not have anything to do with the substance of those propositions, but who it is that says them.
Okay.
And this is very hard. So this is a very, I think, non-Eurocentric idea. It's a very non-Enlightenment idea, and it's a weird idea to me. But I find that I'm more and more thinking in those terms, and I just put it out for you. I don't have an explanation for it.
Okay, so that would be one way to deal with Eurocentrism. Would you say that the other way that you do it, well, of course, in your writings, you've always tried to look for or challenge Eurocentric positions, and just the way you deconstruct the objects, the authors that you study, is also a way, I think, to destabilize the Eurocentrism. But would you say that another way is also the academic milieu that you've tried to form through students and connections and other colleagues in other places, a way to do that destabilization?
Well, I hope one could do more of that, but then we organize events, in Helsinki at the heart of Europe, and we get, for instance, in our summer course, we get about 2/3 of the applications to the summer course are from outside Europe. And then when the summer course itself opens, we find that 90% of those who actually come there and participate are Europeans. Now, about 30%, 40% of the applications come from Africa, from Ghana, from this year from the Republic of the Congo. And we know already that these people
won't get a visa.
Either they won't get a visa, or if they do get a visa, we will never see them. So that poses the question. No, because they are not in the process of coming to Helsinki, but in the process of coming to Europe. So that's a thing, and one asks oneself, is that a way of changing the world? So we open them more and we admit them, and we write to the Finnish visa authorities, yes, we want to have these people there, knowing already well that they wouldn't be here. So that's a question that one asks oneself. But of course, so we are trying to do in Helsinki and with people like you and others, trying to find people in the outside Europe, in Africa, I suppose specifically. It's easier in Asia, who we could invite to events and maybe financially support them. So that's always there. But this is tough. And there are often the candidates which we find turn out to be educated in American universities or in Paris, or they come from SOAS in London.
Right.
And yeah, so it's hard, but I think that's one aspect. Yeah, that should be one aspect of one's non-Eurocentric efforts.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it just isn't there a sense in which
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, but this is yours.
Go ahead.
Well, a sense in which the Eurocentrism that you are talking about is now not carried out by European themselves. I mean, you were just talking about it speaks directly to that, but Eurocentrism, at least in the way that initially you began to talk about it, is now in the hands of, well, I mean, the 19th century, then I think works exemplifies the way in which it was carried out not by Europeans, but by Latin Americans. And then nowadays, we could even talk about the 21st century as being carried out by others, not Europeans. And so we talk about how the 21st century is not going to be the European century anymore. Yet we see a lot of the same language actually being carried out by the Chinese, by the, the emerging powers, they're supposed non-Western emerging powers, India and so on. Are we still talking about Eurocentrism, or this is something else? Is Eurocentrism another name for modernity? And if that is going on elsewhere, so what are the strategies then that you have to? Because it's not only allowing them to talk sometimes actually sanctions the violence that you now know shouldn't be happening, or you think it shouldn't be happening. So how does that I mean, international.
Well, the jury, I suppose, politically is still out whether the European vocabularies are in the process of becoming the universal vocabularies, and that the world is in the process of becoming Eurocentric in the sense that those languages that rule us, languages of economy, languages of technology, languages of democratic party politics, of statehood, of the nation state, that those languages were European languages and that they will unify the world once in a time. And can we then say that we're all Europeans, that the alien has come inside all of us? Well, I suppose that it's possible that that takes place. And I find that when I interact with Chinese colleagues or Japanese colleagues, that it's pretty easy, actually. But it's easy not because I know much about China or Japan or Chinese languages, but it's because they speak English and they are international lawyers and they come from states and we have a common Eurocentric language. This is what I want to finish. This is that, however, there must be a moment at which if this process of Europe becoming the universal realizes itself, that when we should just stop worrying about it.
Sure.
That the hybridity and the irony have become such, and that the world changes, the power relations in the world change, new people come to dominate it, that our political concern should be in some other place apart from the European origin of those languages.
But of course, it could be that then it was only a misnomer. That instead of being really Eurocentric, it was something else. It was the name for like I say, maybe modernity. Because it's a violent language. It's a language that...
Yeah, that's what Europeans always thought. They never thought that this was anything specifically European about technology.
That's right. So what has been ravishing here is not the Eurocentric element, but maybe that other. So it's not that we should stop worrying, no? We should be maybe develop other kinds of strategy. I don't know. I mean, is that a valid question? I don't want to take over. Sorry.
No, well, can I just add to that maybe we don't even need to talk about Eurocentrism anymore in terms of the critical languages or the critical tools that we use are often produced in Europe. I mean, so is that Eurocentrism is it because it's a place of production of knowledge as well, or I mean, it's sometimes confusing. What is because is there like a good Eurocentrism and a bad Eurocentrism?
Yeah, I suppose there is. Yes, there is. Of course, there is a good and bad Eurocentrism, and those languages and knowledges are largely produced in Europe or in the United States, which in the relevant regards can be thought of as the extension of Europe. And for most of the time, the expansion of these languages and technologies has been regarded as equivalent to modernization, globalization, the world becoming united. The fact that it's becoming united through languages developed in Europe or European origin institutions has not been regarded a problem. Sure. So it's only with decolonization and the rise of post-colonial theory that the topos of Eurocentrism has arisen as a specific issue, which has enabled us to make the critical point that what you think is a universal language actually is a European language. Now, that can be taken as a description, as a historical description, as a kind of a description in the field of sociology of knowledge, or it can be taken as a criticism, and it's not clear always which it is. And my uses of Eurocentrism, for example, constantly ambivalently move between the sociology of knowledge point, descriptive point, and a critical point. And I'm often uncertain myself as to on which side I am. I suppose when it's a question of more obviously bad practices, then to say that those practices are Eurocentric, it would be a critical point. But then it can be just an analytical point also. So what about biology in the world? Okay, biology was invented in the 19th century or earlier in the 17th century, and then it developed in certain European institutions, and then it went abroad, etc. One can say biology is Eurocentric, but I don't think that's a critique of biology.
Right.
So, but nevertheless, that doesn't undermine the correctness of the sentence itself. But there is a final, again, a complex point, which I have to bring out, although I don't have the means to analyze it really. And it's that we may have to ask, who is it that uses that language? And although it's the same language, if it's used by those people, then there's a work for criticism. Whereas if it's used by those people, then it's okay. Again, so this is to break down the universalism. So when you ask the question legitimately as to what happens when we use this language, so my sensitivity immediately links to the we. What do you mean by we? Mm-hmm. And we Europeans have this linguistic tendency of using the first person plural as indicating everybody in the world. And that is a very dubious thing. So again, I come back to the statement that exactly the same sentence might be illegitimate when it's uttered by A, whereas it's legitimate when it's uttered by B. Now, that is a genuinely non-universalist position.
Right. That also approaches you, would you agree with this, to the strategic essentialism that Spivak famously invoked in that essay about Can the Subaltern Speak? Would you agree with that? Is that possible?
Well, yeah, so of course. And I notice that I take those kinds of positions often, but I don't like the way she puts it forward. So the term strategic essentialism, I find that alienating. That is kind of a stopgap. So it's just strategic essentialism, that's all. Whereas it could also be an opening to something that doesn't have the bad faith connotation that the Spivakian term has. That perhaps if you work on it more, you will get beyond the idea that it's merely strategic.
Okay. I see a lot of examples, for instance, for strategic essentialism in the alliance between anthropology and law, especially when Indian communities are kind of seeking to claim benefits and so on. I've seen that in the States, I've seen that in Colombia as well. Would you say that kind of practice is badly described as a strategic essentialism, or that's the kind of, will that be the practice that you're looking for, you're thinking of? Or would that be the practice that you think it's in bad faith?
And now, am I entitled to say that I don't know? I don't have an opinion. I don't. And I could concoct an opinion here that could be as coherent as possible with what I've said, but that would be wrong. I would take a position on a situation that I don't know well enough.
This is quite pertinent to the debates in America, for instance, because there's a lot of identity politics that is.
I was thinking what happened to me in a recent conference where you were present in the audience. That I talked. Well, they asked me to talk about again the Latin American story, and I tell my critical story, and the commentator on the panel was one of the lawyers on the International Court of Justice, one of the Latin American lawyers.
Okay, so we had two choices.
So he was supposed to comment on this, because I was the one that was supposedly talking, but instead of
Sepulveda kan saada trindat.
So instead of commenting, what he did was correct my story. So he said, her thing is interesting, but that's not really the story. The story is that Latin Americans contributed. I mean, the typical one we know. They contributed with all of this.
So these guys are the
contribution argument, right? And so he corrected my mistaken interpretation.
Yes, I can so well understand he would do that.
Right, but that's not only him. I mean, I have several people who understand my work as promoting again this Latin American thing, right? And they say, "Oh, thank you for what you're doing. That's great. We need someone to, promote this." I said, No, what I'm trying to show is that these guys use this argument, but they're not using it from I mean, they're using it also to be imperialist in their own places. They're also racist. I mean, there are a lot of things that I wouldn't agree. I mean, there are a few things that might be important to look at, but in general, it's an elite that has a project that is not one that I would look as critical or as opening for that broader Latin American region that supposedly they're defending. It's really a elite minority who wants to be at the center of production of knowledge, but more than that, there's not much more than that. So that's where you have the reverse effect in terms of letting them speak, right? Letting them speak because they're not from Europe, but at the same time they may have a very authoritarian, position that, from a critical perspective, we would not agree with.
Yes.
That was an example, maybe, from what you were saying, that using the essentialism, that way they are using strategic essentialism, but in a bad way.
No, I think one thing we've learned in the course of these years in international legal fields is that there's no reason. So even if one is into the critical stream and one realizes that Eurocentrism is a big problem, that outside Europe, that what exists there isn't made any better by this critique of Europe, and that we have to take whatever comes from there with an equally critical attitude. So it's not as if everything and everybody that came from the South would just be great and acceptable.
But that leads me to another experience from a recent conference. What time is it? Are we okay with time? Okay, we have that. We should probably be going. But in the recent conference, again, the European Society of International Law, we were talking with some people that your name was everywhere, but in a way sort of becoming the mainstream, like by using your work, it was now legitimate to say things, right?
Whatever.
But I mean, you had to use your work, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, are they using it because his work has been so good that he's finally been able to make them think about these issues, or are they just using it again to cause an effect, and they don't really understand the critique that you have there? So when does the critique become the mainstream?
And it stops being,
and changes something, or when is it used by the mainstream to continue the status quo, let's say?
Yes, well, you very charitably left out the third and the least positive interpretation is that I'm not really critical at all. That it's very easy for a European mainstream to appropriate me. I'm just saying something everybody has known all along and have found words and ways of expressing that fits the times, and therefore it's suitable. I don't know, and I of course am not in an authoritative position to judge on